The municipality's records listed the assessed value of the houseboat as $400. Not $4,000, not $400,000, $400, which was less than what Colette Renard had paid for her winter coat, less than the deductible on the car insurance she could no longer afford, and exactly the kind of number that makes a county clerk look at you with something between pity and embarrassment when they slide the paper across the desk. It was the only thing her late husband's brother left her. Not her husband. Her husband had been gone 11 years, taken by a February heart attack on a Tuesday morning, while she was at work filing other people's tax returns. No, this was Uncle Rayal, a man she had met exactly 4 times in her life, who smelled of pipe tobacco and river water, who called her Cher when they shook hands, and never once explained why he lived alone on a barge at the end of a dock in Welland, Ontario, when the rest of the Renard family had long since moved to the suburbs and stopped asking questions about him. Rayal Renard had died in October, quietly the way he had apparently lived. The notice came from a solicitor in St. Catharines, a woman named Brassard, who spoke in the measured tone of someone accustomed to delivering news that was neither good nor bad, only true. There was no cash in the estate, no savings. A modest account had covered the funeral. What remained was the houseboat, moored at slip 14 of the Welland River Heritage Marina, assessed at $400 by a municipality that had been trying for 3 years to get Rayal to apply for a heritage designation so they could stop worrying about it. Colette had stood in her kitchen when she took that call, looking at the stack of bills on the counter. The kind of stack you don't open anymore because you already know what's inside. And she had said thank you to the solicitor, and hung up and stood there for a very long time with her hand still on the phone. She was 53 years old. She had $1,240 in her checking account, a 2008 Civic that burned oil, and a lease on a 1-bedroom in Hamilton that was coming up for renewal at a number she hadn't been able to say out loud yet. She had worked 22 years at the same accounting firm, Larkin and Moss, and in September they had called her into the boardroom and told her with genuine regret that her position was being restructured. They gave her a plant from the reception area, and a handshake from a man she had trained 11 years earlier. Her daughter in Calgary had offered the spare room. Colette had said she was fine. She was not fine. Before we go any further, if you've landed on this video and this story sounds like something you'd want to hear all the way through, take a second to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because what Colette found on that houseboat is the kind of thing you don't see coming, even when you think you know where a story is going. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We always love to know how far these stories travel now. Let's go back to Welland. The drive from Hamilton took 40 minutes on a clear day. Colette made it in late November, on a day that wasn't clear at all, that particular Ontario gray that settles in around Remembrance Day and doesn't lift until April, the sky the color of old dishwater, the bare trees along the Niagara Escarpment looking like they'd given up on everything. She'd told herself she was going to look at the houseboat, take some photographs, call a marine broker, and be done with the whole business by supper time. She had a notebook in her bag, with the broker's number already written in it. The Welland River Heritage Marina was smaller than she'd imagined. A gravel lot, a low building with a hand-painted sign, 6 slips running out into the canal, and the kind of quiet that belongs to working water in winter. The creak of lines, the knock of hull against dock, the distant mechanical groan of the lift lock somewhere up the canal. Colette parked between a rusted pickup and a boat trailer and sat for a moment with the engine ticking. Slip 14 was at the far end of the dock. The houseboat was called La Veille. She could make out the name even from a distance, painted in careful black letters along the bow. The paint worn but deliberate, the kind of name someone had thought about. It was not what she'd expected. She had expected something closer to disaster, a thing listing to one side, peeling and waterlogged, confirmation that Rayal's life had been as chaotic as the family had quietly assumed. Instead, La Veille sat level and solid in the slip, its hull the color of old cedar, its windows covered in plastic sheeting for the winter. The dock boards had been recently swept. A cord of split firewood was stacked under a small overhang at the stern. Someone had been taking care of this. The key from the solicitor's envelope was a plain brass one on a loop of dock line. It fit the padlock on the forward door without complaint. Colette stepped inside and waited for her eyes to adjust. The interior smelled of wood smoke and linseed oil, and something she couldn't name immediately. Something that came to her a moment later, as her chest tightened without warning. The same pipe tobacco Real had smoked when she'd met him at the funeral of her husband's father, all those years ago. She had forgotten that she remembered it. The body doesn't forget the way the mind forgets. The main cabin was narrow but thoughtful. Bookshelves built into both walls, filled with paperbacks and field guides, and a row of binders with dates written on their spines in black marker. A wood stove in the corner, small and cast iron, with a firebox that still held the gray ash of a recent fire. A folding table bolted to the wall with 2 chairs tucked under it, mismatched. A kitchen chair and a camping chair, as though a second seat had been added at some point, and the matching one had never mattered. A small galley kitchen at the stern end, and above it, a shelf holding 3 coffee mugs when one man living alone needed only one. Colette stood in the cabin her husband's uncle had left her, 1,240 and a Civic to her name, and the practical part of her began the arithmetic. Marine broker, sell for scrap or slip. Walk away from this town, from this family she had kept at arm's length since Claude died, from the last 11 years of managing and diminishing and managing again. Turn $400 of assessed water into whatever someone would pay for it, and put the whole sorry chapter behind her. That was the plan when she walked through the door. It lasted until she looked up and saw the photograph. It was tacked above the bookshelves, a snapshot in a dollar store frame, faded at the edges. Real standing on the dock in a plaid jacket, his arm around a young man of maybe 20, both of them squinting into summer sun. The young man was laughing at something off camera. Real was not looking at the camera at all. He was looking at the young man with an expression Colette had never seen on the face of any man in the Renard family. Pure, uncomplicated pride. She didn't drive back to Hamilton that evening. The river was icing at the edges, and the dock road was no place for a Civic after dark, and those were both true. But the truer thing was that she wasn't ready to leave the smell of the pipe tobacco. She found an old wool blanket in the forward berth, shook it twice, and lay down in her coat, and the boat rocked her to sleep so gently that she didn't realize it had happened until she woke in the dark to the sound of footsteps on the dock. Careful footsteps. The step-paw step of someone who knew which boards were soft. Colette sat up. Through the gap in the plastic sheeting over the window she could see a shape on the dock. A figure slight, wearing a dark jacket, carrying something in both arms. Not running, not hiding. Moving with the matter-of-fact deliberateness of someone doing a regular chore who has just noticed, with some alarm, that the boat they are tending is occupied. She took the flashlight from the hook by the door, because it was the nearest thing to hand, and opened the forward hatch. Cold air fell in. The figure stopped. A young woman, early 20s maybe, hair pulled back under a toque, holding a paper bag and a small bag of kindling, with the startled expression of someone caught doing something they'd believed was entirely private. "I didn't know anyone was here," she said. Her breath smoked in the cold. "Who are you?" Colette asked. "I bring the groceries." The young woman nodded at the bag and the kindling. "I keep the lines checked when it freezes up. I painted the trim back in September." She looked at the light in the cabin, then back at Colette. "Nobody told me anyone was coming. Her name was Freda. Just Freda, for the first 3 days, because that was all she would give. She wouldn't come inside the first morning." She stood on the dock with the toque pulled low and answered questions in the short, precise way of someone who has learned that the wrong answer gets you sent away. Colette brought coffee to the dock, instead 2 cups, and they sat on the mooring cleats in the cold, watching the canal, not talking, which turned out to be the only currency Freda accepted. "You knew him," Colette said eventually. "Not a question. He let me stay." A pause. "In the forward berth. He said I could use it when the shelter was full. He didn't ask me anything first. He just made tea and showed me where the blankets were." Colette looked at the young woman's profile. The way she held the cup with both hands, like she was deciding whether to keep it. "How long did you stay?" "On and off. 2 years almost." Freda looked at the water. "I was in a bad spot for a long time. He didn't try to fix it, he just kept the light on. There's a lamp in the stern window. He ran it every night. You could see it from the footbridge on the east side of the canal." She said it simply, the way you'd describe a landmark. "Turn left at the church, the light's on in the stern." Colette filed that away. "If you're still with us, thank you for staying. Because what's on that boat goes a great deal deeper than a lamp in a window. Subscribe now if you haven't already, and stay with us, because Colette Renard kept something on that houseboat that his family never knew about, and what it reveals about the man is something Colette hadn't been prepared for at all. She couldn't make herself call the broker. She tried twice, on the second day, and both times she ended up standing on the dock, looking at La Veille with the phone in her hand and the number undialed. The boat kept showing her things she hadn't finished understanding. The mismatched chairs, the 3 mugs. A hook by the forward door at 2 different heights, as though it had been moved more than once to accommodate different visitors. So she stopped trying to sell it, and started doing the thing she'd always done when her life came apart, which was to make something work with her hands. The plastic winter sheeting needed resealing at 2 corners where the wind had gotten in. The wood stove, when she lit it properly for the first time, drew with a clean pull that meant the stovepipe was clear. Freda's work, she found out later. The galley tap had a slow drip that turned out to be a washer, and Colette had replaced enough washers in her life to know the fix without looking it up. Freda began appearing earlier each day. Not quite with her, always at a slight remove, working on the dock lines or checking the bilge while Colette worked on the cabin, the way 2 people establish a rhythm without agreeing to one. "He taught you to do that?" Freda said one afternoon, watching Colette reseal the window edge. "My husband did, Claude. He was good with boats." It was the first time she'd said his name in months without it sitting wrong in her mouth. "He and Réal used to. I think they used to come here together, before we were married." Freda was quiet for a moment. He had a picture of Claude, on the shelf. Colette hadn't found it yet. She went back in and looked, and there it was between the field guides. A smaller snapshot she'd missed. 2 young men on a different dock. Summer again, younger than she'd ever known either of them to be. Claude, maybe 25, leaning against a railing. Réal beside him with that same not looking. The camera looked from the other photograph, looking at the people he loved, not the lens. The days took a shape. Morning coffee on the dock, cold enough now that the canal had a skim of ice by 6 a.m. A walk along the towpath before the light fully came. The lockkeeper's building dark and shuttered for the season. The bare willows trailing their tips in the current. Then work on the boat until the light failed, which was early. Then the wood stove and whatever she could make from the provisions she'd brought down from Hamilton on the second day, when she'd admitted she wasn't going back that night either. One evening, Freda came in, without being asked, and sat at the folding table. Colette put soup on the stove and didn't comment, the way she was learning to do with this young woman. "Hold still, don't remark. Let the moment be ordinary." "Can I ask you something?" Freda said. "Yes," Colette said. A long pause. "Did they tell you anything about him? In the family?" Colette thought about how to answer that honestly. "They said he was private, that he'd had a hard time in his 40s and chosen a quieter life. Nobody knew much about the boat." Freda nodded slowly. "He chose the boat because it moved. When things got bad in one place, you could move. And then he stopped needing to move and he stayed." She looked at the lamp in the stern window, which Colette had been lighting every evening without consciously deciding to. "He didn't light that for himself," Freda said. "I asked him once. He said the people who needed it knew where to look." Colette didn't say anything. She served the soup, and in the silence that followed, which was the most comfortable silence she'd sat in a very long while, she understood that she had not come here to sell a boat. She had come here to find out why a man she barely knew had left it to her, specifically when he could have left it to no one. On the 8th day, she moved the wood stove 1.5 inches to true up the hearth, and the floor told her something. It was the scrape of the stove leg over a seam in the cabin floor that was too clean, too deliberate, to be the ordinary gap of settling wood. Colette knelt and ran her fingers along it. A straight line, then a right angle. A panel cut to lift. She worked her thumbnail into the edge, and the panel came up with the dry exhale of a space that had been sealed for a long time. And underneath was a cavity the depth of the floor joists, dry and dark, and smelling of cedar and old paper. Inside were 2 things. A canvas ledger, the kind with a sewn spine, fat and soft-cornered, the cover marked only with a date range in black pen, 1994-2024, and a tin, the coffee can variety, large, its lid secured with a neat wrap of electrical tape and considerably heavier than it should be for something that size. Colette lifted the ledger out with both hands. She opened it at the table with Freda's soup going cold in the bowl and the wood stove ticking in the corner. The first entry was dated April 3, 1994. Her late husband's uncle had written in a small slanted hand, slightly left-leaning, the hand of someone who had been told as a child to correct their grip and never quite managed it. A young man named Curtis came to the dock tonight. He'd been walking since Thorold. His mother's boyfriend had thrown him out, and he had a split lip and nowhere particular to go. fed him. He slept in the forward berth. I drove him to his grandmother's in Fonthill in the morning, left him with $20 and my phone number, and told him to call if the grandmother's situation didn't hold. He won't call. The number's there if he does. Colette turned the page. If you've followed us this far, please take a moment right now to subscribe if you haven't, because what's written in that ledger is the thing that turns this whole story into something Colette, and everyone who knew Colette Renard, will carry for the rest of their lives. We'll be right back in that cabin with her. The second entry, 3 weeks later, a different name. A woman in her 50s who'd left a house she was afraid to go back to, given the birth for 2 nights, and driven by rail to a shelter in Welland, that he apparently knew on a first-name basis with the intake coordinator. A teenager who'd aged out of foster care in Niagara Falls and had been sleeping in the pump house at the east end of the marina for 2 weeks before Colette noticed. A man named Alistair, a retired steelworker from Stelco, who'd come to the boat at 2 in the morning with no explanation given and stayed a week, leaving without saying goodbye, and whose entry ended, "I hope the week helped. He knows where the dock is." Page after page, 30 years of pages. The lamp in the window, the forward berth, $20 and a phone number, the name of a shelter, a social worker, a legal aid office, and at the end of nearly every entry, in one form or another, the same line, "The light's on. He knows the boat's here." Colette read aloud after a while because it felt wrong to let the words disappear silently into the air of the cabin they'd been kept from. Freda had come back inside at some point and was sitting on the floor with her back against the bookshelf, her knees drawn up, not reading over Colette's shoulder but listening. When Colette reached an entry with no name, only initials, and the words asked me not to write it down but wanted to say thank you, and I said there was nothing to thank. Freda put her face in her hands, not crying, just holding very still the way a person does when something they've been carrying alone for a long time suddenly has a witness. Colette set the ledger down and didn't move for a long moment. She understood now what the boat had been trying to show her all week. The mismatched chairs because a second person was always possible. The 3 mugs because 2 guests sometimes arrived at once. The hook at 2 heights because packs come in different sizes. And a man who expected people to arrive, expected them to bring what they could carry. The lamp in the stern window, that she'd lit each night by instinct, that Freda said could be seen from the footbridge on the east side of the canal. For 30 years, Colette Renard had kept a working houseboat on a working canal in a mid-sized Ontario city. And he had kept a light in the stern window, and the people who needed it had found their way down the dock. He had fed them and listened to them and driven them places and written each one down not as a burden, not as a story, but as a person who had been in his cabin on a specific night and deserved to be remembered. He had never told the family. He had never told anyone with a clipboard or a press release. He had simply left the light on. Colette opened the coffee tin. Inside were 73 letters. She counted them carefully, twice, because the number felt like something that should be accurate. 73 letters in 73 different hands, on notepaper and napkins and the backs of bus transfers, and in one case, a strip of brown paper bag with "Thank you, Colette" written in crayon, as though someone had made do with what was nearest. Some gave full names. Some gave only a first name or initials. Some gave nothing at all, just the words and a postmark. A woman who wrote that she'd sat on the dock on a September night in 2003 with no intention of sitting anywhere ever again, and that the light in the window had made her knock, and that she had 3 grandchildren who existed because she knocked instead of walking past. A young man who wrote that Colette had driven him into a treatment program in Port Colborne in 2009 and slipped a 20 in his jacket pocket and never mentioned it afterward. A family, parents and a child, who had arrived at the marina in a car with everything they owned in it in a February cold snap and stayed 6 days, the child sleeping in the forward berth while the parents slept in shifts, and who wrote, together. The letter was clearly written by 2 people. That they had not had a plan when they drove to the water that night, and that the light had been the plan. Freda read over her shoulder now, which she wouldn't have done a week ago, and when they reached an entry with her own initials at the bottom, she came back 3 times. The 4th time she had a job and stayed for coffee. I let her have the berth key made for herself. She earned it. Freda was quiet for a very long time and then said, simply, "I kept mine." She reached into her jacket and held it up briefly. A brass key on a dock line, identical to the one the solicitor had sent. Colette didn't say anything. There was nothing to add to that. 2 days later, she drove down the main street of Welland for the first time. A street she didn't know well enough to love, and was beginning to know too well to leave. She bought lamp oil and a bag of oats at the hardware store, and the man behind the counter, older heavyset, an Acadian lilt in his English, glanced at her and said, "You're Réal's question." "His nephew's widow," she said, "Colette." He set down the lamp oil and extended his hand. "Gustave, I run the Lock Tenders Association. Réal helped my son get into a program in 2011. My son is a journeyman electrician in Sudbury now." He held her hand a beat longer than a hardware handshake normally runs. "I've been waiting to say thank you to someone in that family for 15 years. He wouldn't take it from me directly." By the time Colette walked back to the marina, she had spoken to 6 people. A woman from the hospital auxiliary who said Réal had called the crisis line on her behalf one night in 2007 and stayed on hold with her until someone answered. A lockkeeper, long retired, who said Réal had quietly written reference letters for at least 4 young men over the years, men who had needed a letter from a responsible adult and had none. An older Métis woman named something that began with a vowel and ended with the same dignity as the rest of her, who said only, "He drove my granddaughter to treaty rights hearings twice because she didn't have a car, and he said the hearing mattered and the distance didn't." None of them had told anyone. None of them had thought they were supposed to. That was the whole of him, Gustave had said. That's how you know it was real. Colette drove back to the marina in the early dark, and the first thing she did when she got on board was fill the lamp and set it in the stern window. Subscribe now if you haven't already. Because what happened 12 days after Colette arrived at that marina is the turn this story has been building toward since the very first entry in that ledger. The truck came down the dock road on a Thursday afternoon, a black pickup, clean, late model. The kind of clean that means a detail shop rather than a careful owner, and parked at the top of the lot with the proprietary assurance of someone who had already decided where they were going. The man who got out moved the same way. 60 maybe, in a good coat, the collar up against the wind, with the particular smile of someone who arrives having already scripted the meeting. "Mrs. Renard," he said, not a question the way the hardware man had used it. The opposite of that. "Colette," she said, "what can I do for you?" His name was Baxter, Norris Baxter, of Canal Side Properties. He handed her a card that she took without looking at it. He turned a slow half-circle, looking at the canal, at the slip, at La Veille sitting level and solid at the end of the dock. "Your late husband's uncle," Baxter said, "was a man I had a great deal of respect for, even when he was difficult." He smiled in the way of someone who has practiced saying difficult as though it were a term of affection. "I made him an offer on this slip 3 times in the last 8 years. 3 very generous offers for a $40 a month municipal mooring permit and a boat the county has assessed at $400. He declined," Colette said. "He was sentimental." Baxter nodded. "Which I understand. But I'd hate for his sentimentality to cost you what it cost him. I've got a development proposal before the municipality right now for 4 slips at the south end of this marina. Heritage designation is being reconsidered, which means this whole stretch of dock becomes an interesting conversation." He named a number. It was not an insulting number. It was the kind of number that, if you said it to a woman with $1,240 in her checking account, was designed to feel like the end of a long, hard problem. She recognized that design. "The slip permit is yours," he continued, "which gives you the legal occupancy. But permits don't survive heritage reconsideration, and a boat valued at $400 that hasn't had a marine survey in. How long has it been? I'd imagine a surveyor might find some concerns. Old wiring, hull integrity, it's a cost of living on the water that most people don't account for." He paused to let that settle. "I'm told you're between things," he said. There it was, that particular turn of phrase in that particular tone, a concern-shaped cruelty. Colette felt the old reflex, the one she'd spent 11 years developing, the one that said, "Be agreeable, make it comfortable, smooth the surface so the moment ends without damage." She'd used that reflex with the partners at Larkin and Moss when they explained her position was being restructured. She'd used it with her son-in-law when he said perhaps Calgary might be a fresh start. She'd used it so many times it had started to feel like breathing. She thought of the ledger. She thought of Réal's small, left-leaning handwriting. She thought of 73 letters in a coffee tin and a young woman who had kept a brass key for 3 years because it was proof. The reflex sat down and stayed quiet. "The slip's not for sale," she said. "The boat's not for sale. Mrs. Renard, Colette, She held his card back out to him. He didn't take it. She set it on the dock rail. You can keep your development proposal. And I'd suggest you look up the marina's designation history before your next meeting with the municipality, because I have a feeling you'll find the conversation less open than you're expecting. Baxter studied her for a moment with an expression that had stopped being a smile some time back. People in your position, he said, tend to come around when they do the arithmetic. I know the arithmetic, Colette said. I'm an accountant. He left. The black truck went back up the dock road and out of the lot without a second look, and Colette stood on the dock until the sound of it was gone. Freda was beside her. She'd come up from the far end of the dock without making a sound. That's the developer, Freda said. He sent someone with a clipboard twice while Real was alive. Real sat on the mooring cleat and read a book until they went away. Colette almost laughed. I don't have a lawyer. I don't know the heritage designation process, and I don't know what a marine survey turns up, and I don't have money for either. Freda was quiet for a moment. Gustave, she said, at the hardware store. His cousin runs the Great Lakes Heritage Marine Society. They do hull surveys for free on registered heritage vessels. Colette looked at her. Real registered La Veille in 2017, Freda said. I helped him with the paperwork. She didn't sleep well that night. She lay in the forward berth and listened to the canal moving under the hull, and thought about the entries in the ledger, about the people who had arrived at this boat with less than she had, at hours darker than this one, and about the man who had set a light in the window and kept it burning on the nights no one came, so it would already be burning on the night someone did. She lit the lamp before she went to bed, set it in the stern window where it had sat for 30 years. The answer came down the dock 3 days later, and it came the way answers had apparently always come down that dock, in the form of someone who owed Colette Renard a debt he had refused to collect. Her name was Désirée Cloutier, and she was 61, with a cane she didn't lean on very hard, and a briefcase that had been into a great many difficult rooms and showed the mileage. She was a retired paralegal from the Niagara Community Legal Clinic, and she had driven from Thorold because Gustave had called her, and because she had been waiting, she said, for several years for the occasion. She sat across from Colette at the folding table and accepted coffee and looked around the cabin the way someone looks at a place they've been told about but never been. Riel called our clinic in 2006, she said, on behalf of a client of his, not that he used that word, a young woman who needed a peace bond and didn't know how to get one. He sat with her in our waiting room for 4 hours. He wasn't family. He wasn't a social worker. He was just the man who'd been keeping the light on, and he thought she deserved someone in her corner. Désirée set down her coffee. She got the bond. She's a nurse in Grimsby now, and Real never once contacted us to follow up, which told me more about him than everything else combined. She opened the Shrive case. Now, this developer of yours, Baxter? She said the name with the patience of someone who has encountered the type before. Walk me through what he said, exactly. Colette did. Désirée listened without expression, making the occasional note. The heritage reconsideration is a bluff, she's when Colette was done. Municipal heritage designations don't get unwound for residential development proposals in a canal-side conservation area. He's counting on you not knowing that. The marine survey threat is also a bluff. A heritage-registered vessel is subject to a different inspection standard, and from what Freda tells me, this boat is maintained better than most that have been surveyed recently. She tapped the table. He's doing what these people do. He's building a picture of precariousness and waiting for you to feel too tired to push back. She looked at Colette over her reading glasses. The question is whether you want to push back. Yes, Colette said. She said it before she'd finished deciding, and then she realized she'd been deciding for 12 days. Désirée nodded as though that had been the expected answer. Then I have one question. Did Real, to your knowledge, ever take any legal steps with respect to this vessel? A trust, a conservation covenant, an arrangement with the municipality about the slip? Colette looked at the coffee tin still sitting on the shelf. She hadn't emptied it completely, and she thought of the solicitor in St. Catherine's, Brassard, and something the woman had said almost in passing that Colette had not thought to follow up on. She mentioned a registered agreement, Colette said slowly, with the municipality. She said it was in the file but not relevant to the probate. She looked at Désirée. I didn't ask what kind of agreement. Désirée set her pen down with the care of someone refraining from saying something too early. Call her, she said. Right now, if you can. and ask her specifically about any registered encumbrances on the slip permit or the vessel. Ask her to read the exact language from the file. Colette called Brassard from the dock in the cold, with Freda sitting on the cleat nearby and Desiree standing in the cabin doorway. Brassard was apologetic and slightly puzzled and went to find the file, and they waited in the particular silence of people who have understood that something is about to matter. When Brassard came back, she read from a registered agreement dated March of 2018. Colette Renard, sole occupant of Slip 14, Welland River Heritage Marina, had entered into a registered community benefit agreement with the city of Welland. In exchange for a reduced mooring rate, the slip and vessel would serve as a registered community resource available to any social service organization in Niagara region, requiring short-term safe harbor for individuals in crisis. The agreement ran with the slip permit. It could not be nullified by a change of ownership, a change of municipal administration, or a heritage reconsideration process of any kind, because it had been submitted simultaneously to the municipal register and to the Region of Niagara Community Services file. Colette listened until Brassard finished reading. "He registered it in 2018, she said when she could manage her voice. 7 years ago, Brassard confirmed. "He didn't mention it to you?" "He didn't mention any of this to anyone," Colette said. She hung up and stood on the dock with the canal moving under the gray November sky, and the lamp burning in the stern window behind her, and she understood something about the man her husband had loved, and the family had misread and she had barely known. He had not been living a smaller life. He had been living the only kind of life that seemed to him worth the trouble of living, and he had built it to last after he was gone, and he had left it to Colette not because she was the closest family member, but because Claude, his nephew, his person, had loved her. And Réal had decided on that basis alone that she could be trusted with something he had cared about. He had not asked her permission. He had simply left the door unlocked and the light on, and trusted her to figure out what they meant. Desiree was smiling when Colette came back into the cabin. "A community benefit agreement registered with the region," the older woman said, "is not a development opportunity. It is in fact the opposite of a development opportunity. It means this slip has a protected community function that supersedes any commercial redevelopment proposal." She folded her glasses. Norris Baxter almost certainly knew about this. A title search of the slip would have surfaced the agreement, which tells us he wasn't planning to buy a community benefit agreement. He was planning to buy a tired woman who didn't know she had one, offer her enough money to make her say yes before she read the small print, and then spend 2 years convincing the city to renegotiate the terms quietly. She stood up. "He was wrong about what you knew, and now he's wrong about what you'll do." Baxter came back to the marina once more, 8 days later. He didn't come down the dock. He sent a woman with a folder and a revised offer, a higher number, and a letter of intent that used the words mutual benefit 4 times. Colette read the letter at the folding table with Desiree beside her, and Desiree read the number with the expression of someone watching a card trick performed by a person who doesn't know they've already been caught. Colette wrote 2 sentences on the back of the letter of intent and gave it to the woman with the folder to take back. "La Veille is not available. The light stays on." She heard the woman's car on the gravel, and then she heard nothing, and she went back inside and put the kettle on. That was how Welland found out about La Veille. Not through a newspaper story, not through a press release, through Gustave, who mentioned it to the Lock Tenders Association, who mentioned it to the Niagara Region Social Workers Directory, who in the way of people who work in connected and underfunded fields, told everyone who needed to know within a season. By February, Colette had received 3 calls from social workers asking about the slip's availability for short-term housing referrals, and the community benefit agreement gave her exactly the structure she needed to say yes to all 3. Freda came and went. Some weeks she was at the marina every day. Some weeks Colette didn't see her. That was the arrangement, unspoken, and Colette kept the forward berth made up and didn't remark on the pattern. There was a coffee mug that had become Freda's by informal designation and lived on a specific hook, and that was enough of a language between them. In January, Colette took a contract position with a small accounting firm in St. Catharines. Brassard had mentioned her name to a colleague who mentioned it to the firm. 3 days a week, enough to cover the slip fee and the propane and the lamp oil with something remaining. She was not comfortable. She was not warm. She was present in her own life in a way she had not been for years. And some mornings when she walked the towpath at 6 a.m., in the dark, she thought that that might be the thing the assessor's card could never account for. Whether a person was living in a place or merely surviving in one. There was a fourth ledger. She bought it at the stationery shop on King Street, the closest she could find to the style of the original, and she kept it in the same compartment under the floor. And she did not tell anyone about it. She did not wait long. It was a Friday evening in late February, ice on the canal and a northwest wind that found every gap in your coat, when headlights appeared at the top of the dock road and a small car came down carefully on the icy gravel and stopped at the edge of the parking lot. A man got out, 50s maybe, in a workman's jacket, moving carefully on the ice, looking at the boat, looking at the light in the stern window, looking at the slip number, looking at the boat again. He stood there long enough that Colette, watching from inside, understood that he was deciding something. She opened the forward hatch. "You're looking for slip 14, she said. It was not a question. He nodded. He came down the dock with his hands in his pockets and stopped at the bottom of the gangway, and she could see now that he was carrying more than the cold was explaining. "I was told, a worker at the outreach," she said. "She said there was a place at the marina, that someone kept the light on." He stopped. "I didn't know if it was still. I thought it might not still be, the light's still on," Colette said. "Come in out of the wind. There's something on the stove." She fed him and let him sit as long as he needed to and did not ask the questions that weren't hers to ask. He stayed 2 nights in the forward berth. On the 3rd morning, Colette drove him to an address in Welland he'd written on a piece of paper, a cousin's house, and parked at the curb and said she'd wait if he needed her to. He didn't need her to. The cousin opened the door. She drove back to the marina and sat at the folding table and opened the 4th ledger and wrote the date and a first name and 3 sentences about what had happened, and at the end of it, the only line that seemed to matter: "The light's on. The door's not locked. Told him he can come back." Freda came in while she was writing, back from wherever she'd been for 2 weeks, toque damp with canal mist, and looked over her shoulder and read the line. "Same as his," she said. "Same as his," Colette agreed. Freda sat down. Colette poured 2 cups of coffee and put them on the table, and neither of them said anything more, which was enough, which had always been enough. Maybe that's the part that's hardest to hold on to. We walk through the world with our eyes on the columns, the numbers, the assessed values, the accounts receivable, because that's the language we've built for worth, and it's not a bad language. It's just incomplete. It leaves out what happens in the stern cabin of a $40 a month mooring permit when a man nobody pays much attention to decides that the light in his window belongs to whoever needs it. Colette Renard kept a ledger of 73 people. He drove them places. He wrote them letters. He sat with them in waiting rooms. He never told anyone, and he never asked to be thanked. And the one legal instrument he filed, the Community Benefit Agreement, in 2018, he filed not to protect himself but to protect the light after he was gone. The most durable thing on that boat wasn't the hull. It was the agreement he'd written in a room by himself and registered without ceremony. The agreement that said, "This place serves people who have nowhere to go, and that is its purpose, and no amount of money changes that." He won the argument with Norris Baxter from 3 years in the past, in a file no one had thought to read. He won it with paperwork, which is the only kind of victory that lasts longer than the person who earned it. Colette Renard had arrived in Welland with a notebook containing a broker's number and a plan to be back in Hamilton by supper time. She had found under the floor of a boat assessed at $400 the entire record of a life that had quietly arranged itself around being useful to people in the dark. She had found 73 letters and 30 years of entries and a lamp that had been burning in the same window since 1994. She stayed. She took the contract in St. Catherine's and learned the canal and learned the lock tenders by name and learned which nights the outreach workers called and which nights someone would simply appear at the top of the dock road. Having found the number from someone who had found it from someone who had once needed it themselves, she kept the 4th ledger and didn't announce it. She filled the lamp every night before anything else. Before the kettle, before the radio, before the evening started. The stern window threw a small yellow light onto the water, no further than 20 meters, but you could see it from the footbridge on the east side of the canal. She had learned that was far enough. Not everyone comes when you light it. Most nights no one does. That is not the point. The point, as Real had understood it and passed on wordlessly, is that you cannot know in advance which night, is the night that matters. So you lighted on all of them, and you do not keep track, and you do not collect what it costs you, and you trust that the good you've done in the dark is still there in the morning, working its way through channels you can't map. A man who had been dead since October was still in March, getting people inside out of the cold. That was his real inheritance. Not the hull, not the permit, not the $400. He left Colette a lamp and a ledger and the simplest instruction in the world. Keep it burning and don't make a thing of it. She didn't. She sat in the stern cabin on clear evenings when the canal went silver in the last light, a mug in both hands, watching the lock lights come on one by one down the waterway. And below her in the window, the lamp she'd lit threw its small, steady circle onto the water, the only private light on that stretch of canal, burning for no one in particular, and for everyone who needed it. The slip held, the light stayed on, and Colette Renard, who had arrived with a broker's number and nowhere left to go, looked out at the water she'd inherited and understood at last that she had not come to Welland to sell something. She had come home.